Up until recently, traveling internationally had changed completely in most countries. Now, the majority of countries have already lifted or partially lifted travel restrictions implemented due to COVID-19. In most Southeast Asian countries, for example, being fully vaccinated and having a pre-departure negative PCR test are enough to exempt you from quarantine, and some countries like South Korea and Thailand won't even force you to be strictly quarantined in a hospital if you don't have severe symptoms while being tested positive upon arrival. Traveling internationally now just seems to become more feasible again in major parts of the world as countries decided to coexist with the current COVID situation. And there is China, which still remains one of the hardest countries to travel to. In addition to all the pre-departure requirements we explained in the last video, arriving and entering China still has a lot of strict requirements that not all people can stand. Upon arrival, you can expect to be quarantined from 14 days up to 56 days, and in some cases like mine, it can be even more than that. This is how China strictly controls international arrivals. At 7 in the morning, 13th of July 2021, I successfully landed in Guangzhou's Baiyun International Airport after 11 hours of flight time from Paris Charles de Gaulle. It then took me 6 hours to finally arrive in my quarantine hotel, which is only about 3.5 kilometers away from the airport. And that's because China leaves no chance for the international arrivals to be anywhere close to the domestic travelers, and that they have to be carefully and strictly isolated. And that actually makes sense. You see, throughout this pandemic, if you look at most countries, public gatherings, festivals, and major celebrations had all been suspended for a long period. But in China, although it has some of the most strict measures when it comes to dealing with COVID-19, life in China seemed really fine in all cities, especially after they started recording very low daily COVID cases. Look at this picture, for example. This was taken in Wuhan in August 2020. Can you imagine? During that period, this kind of activity was nearly impossible in major parts of the world. In short, China was like, you can live and enjoy your life like normal as long as your city contains the spread of the virus. And they actually succeeded in that. So when China decided to partially open its borders to international travelers, they had to implement some of the most strict measures to avoid the influx of imported cases from international travelers. And those measures fall into 3 phases: upon arrival, hotel quarantine, and your final destination's quarantine. The moment international travelers arrive in China, and before they even go through immigration, they had to present all the health-related documents, including PCRs and blood test reports, and all the QR codes obtained before departure. This process alone took me around an hour, and then arrivals are directed to the testing facility inside the airport for the PCR or nucleic acid test, and that includes both the nasal and throat swab. From my experience, that test was the most painful test I've ever had. When completing all the COVID testing procedures, travelers are then allowed to go through immigration, take their luggage, and stand in a very long queue to get into the shuttle bus that will take them to their designated quarantine hotels. I spent about 2 to 3 hours in that queue before I got into the shuttle bus, in which I waited for another hour until we finally headed to the quarantine hotel. The quarantine hotels designated by the Chinese government vary in prices according to the area and the hotel's quality, but the average price is usually between $800 and $1,000 per 14 days. The first day of the quarantine is usually very stressful as you have to wait for the result of the test that you had at the airport. If it turns negative, you can resume your quarantine. If it's positive, an ambulance will take you directly to a hospital, but more on this part in the next video. Now, let's get to the fun part here. You see, in China, each province and city has the authority to decide how long quarantine can be. So for example, Guangzhou has 14 plus 7. That means if you land in Guangzhou, you'll have to quarantine in a hotel for 14 days plus 7 days home quarantine. In some places like Chongqing, you'll be required to do 14 plus 7 plus 7. That is 7 days centralized medical quarantine like a hotel, 7 days home quarantine, and another 7 days community health monitoring, meaning that you can go out, but you will still have to be constantly tested and screened for temperature. Wuhan City takes it a little further and implemented 14 days centralized medical quarantine, plus 14 days home quarantine, and another 14 days community health monitoring. Some cities even go extreme, like Shenyang, Liaoning province, where you'll have to do 21 days hotel quarantine, plus 7 days home quarantine, and 28 self-monitoring without without being able to go out. In order to complete all the quarantine process, your PCRs and blood tests have to be negative all the time. If your first quarantine is 14 days, in most cases you'll have to be tested at least 3 times, the 3rd day, the 7th day, and the last day, which is the 14th. If your next destination is another province, let's say Chongqing, you'll have to be carefully isolated throughout the whole journey until you arrive in Chongqing. After arrival, an ambulance or a private car will then take you to your 7-day home quarantine. The number of tests you will have here depends on the local policy. If all the tests are negative here, then you will enter another 7-day community health monitoring. Only after that is when you are free. Now, of course, this is when everything goes well without any problems. A lot of travelers actually have tested positive either on the very first day or later during quarantine time. And what happened to them is a complete different story with special procedures that I'm going to be covering in the next video.